Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome, everyone, to our webinar this afternoon. We're really happy to be having such wonderful speakers on our panel. And so I'm excited to welcome you all and to welcome them. So I'm going to introduce the topic to begin with. I'll introduce our speakers and let them tell us all about their areas of expertise as well. So to ensure that everyone knows where they are, you're at the webinar with the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. And this is a webinar on urban space in times of crisis in the Middle East and North Africa region. And of course, our speakers have specific expertise on Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria as well. So to welcome you in on the topic, I think you've all read the description, but we were really interested in having an event that specifically focused on urban public space. We've seen in the region that in recent decades, even specifically, there has been, an increasing focus, increasing contestation and regulation of public space in the Middle East. And this is especially the case we've seen in times of crisis, which might include conflict, revolution, protest movements, and so on. So these urban spaces in the cities that we're all interested in, public squares, parks, and so on, really hold a very special meaning for so many of the citizens and residents in the region and in the cities that we're mostly interested in today. And we've seen, of course, even in the past 2 years, with protest movements developing in countries like Iraq, Sudan, of course, Lebanon, just how pivotal these spaces are. These sites can be the site of political or economic or social development. They can be sites of resistance, exchange, movement building as well, but also the site of greater surveillance, of violence and destruction, as we'll hear about today, of targeting by armed groups or even the state. But of course, this also brings in, very big questions about issues of governance, of privatization, environmental policies, of course. So this is a very big topic to be talking about today. But of course, we're very much interested in what crisis means and represents and how space comes into contact or intersection with this idea. So to that end, we focus our attention today on some of the following question rather. How do such crises shape urban spaces, and what does public space mean for the prospect of peace or political change? And so to unpack some of the themes that I've mentioned today, we're very grateful and very happy to have three wonderful speakers discuss issues or entry points to this concept for us today. So first of all, and this will be the speaking order for the webinar today, we will have Professor Mona Harub, who is a professor of urban studies and politics at the American University in Beirut. She's also the co-founder of Beirut Urban Lab, which is a research lab that focuses on studies of urbanization in the global south. And Professor Harub's work also explores the questions of governance, statehood, crises, activism, and collective solidarities in urban contexts. The second speaker will be Dr. Amara Zeus, who completed his PhD in 2019 at the University of Bath and is now an analyst at ARUP. I hope I've not ARUP, perhaps. And he's also a short-term research associate at Oxford University. His research really spans many topics, and this involves understanding destruction and reconstruction, culture, and the built environment in times of conflict. And in particular, he focuses on the ongoing crisis in Syria since 2011. And last but not least, of course, we have Dr. Omari, who completed her PhD at Sheffield University and is currently a lecturer in architectural history and theory at the University of Babylon in Iraq. Dr. Aula's research interests are very wide and explore historical issues around architecture and design, as well as more contemporary questions around space, its political and symbolic power, and of course, lastly, on questions of cultural heritage as well. So she has a wide expertise to pick from here today. now that we've introduced everyone, I will give them all about 7 or 8 minutes to speak to us about their respective countries of expertise. And then after that, we'll allow some time for questions and exchange between the 3 speakers. And we'd love to hear from all of you who have joined us today if you have any questions. So please feel free to type questions as you think of them in the Q&A box, and I'll keep an eye on them. And we'll have some time for discussion after the speeches. So please, Professor Harub, if you would like to go ahead.
Sure. Thank you very much, Yasmin, and thank you to the Swedish Institute of International Affairs for organizing this panel. I'm very happy to be in such good company. So let me start by sharing a few slides with you. Okay, and let's start. Okay, so the question that Yasmin and the colleagues shared with us is, how do crises shape urban spaces, and what does public space mean for prospects of peace or political change? I will mainly reflect in the short time I have on the relationship of space to political change, because I don't work on peace building, and try to reflect from the lens of Beirut on this question. So, of course, crises shape urban space in a myriad of ways. And I think we all lived and are living through a pandemic crisis that restricted enormously our access to public space. We all have an idea about how crisis shapes urban and public space in this way. Our access to public space was restricted, but it was also heavily securitized and militarized in many cities around the world. And it was also leveraged by central authorities to consolidate their own power in some cities more than others. And in some cities, health authorities used the health crisis to thwart protest, opposition, uprisings. And Beirut was a very good case in point, where the tents of the protesters that were still in place in March and February 2020, when the pandemic hit Lebanon, were removed forcefully by the police using the public health justification rhetoric. And the sectarian machine, in the case of Lebanon, was redeployed, and it re-territorialized the public realm across Lebanon, whereby sectarian actors started providing health services to their constituents and took control, reappropriated the public realm that had been appropriated by the revolutionaries. So this is an example just to, that is a bit of the current crisis that is being deployed in Lebanon, the political, economic, and social crisis, which I think opens more opportunities for shaping public space, and it widens the prospects for political change. And I think this is more relevant to our discussion today, especially in context of post-colonial states, where public institutions have been eviscerated from their functions as protectors of the public, as guarantors of the commons, and have been working instead to capture the public for the interest of the oligarchy and its constituents, and for the reproduction of a political system that keeps them and serve their power. So in that sense, I ask that question: in what ways specifically does urban space shape political change? And this is the question that I'm going to try to answer very quickly today, building on a recent chapter I authored for a forthcoming book on the Lebanese uprisings that is co-edited by Jeffrey Karam and Rima Majid. And namely, I argue that urban space shapes collective action in at least 2 ways. First, I believe that urban space, because it incorporates physical and material characteristics, and I can go back to that in the discussion. I'm not going to unpack what I mean by the material and the symbolic characteristics of space. I'm hoping that everybody shares that basic understanding of space. The fact that we have this materiality and symbolism of urban space, this provides protesters and opposition groups with a myriad of possibilities to appropriate space and use it for collective action. So I will develop this a little bit, And I will focus specifically on how in the Beirut uprisings, 3 types of public space or urban spaces were used to advance collective action: public and open spaces, abandoned buildings, and infrastructure. And the second, I would say, portion of the argument I make is that urban space also produced a diverse range of what I'm terming, alongside other actors, performative stages. So stages where collective action is rehearsed, nurtured, challenged, and often repressed and thwarted. And this is done at multiple scales, from the street to the neighborhood, to the city, to the region, and sometimes at the scale of the nation. So these stages matter even if they are temporary and fleeting, because they allow political imaginaries and real utopias, using the term of Ellen Wright, to be deployed and to be enacted. So in many ways, the case study of Lebanon is a good one because it embodies how urban spaces are necessary for collective action, because they provide these vital ingredients for mobilizing, organizing, and these ingredients have been identified by authors and built on their work. These are mainly about the density that we find in urban space, the diversity of urban space, and the fact that in urban space we have some strategic sites that can be leveraged. So quickly, I go over the 3 types of spaces I mentioned that embody both the material and the symbolic. The first is the occupation of central squares and spaces, and we have seen that it's a typical mode of spatial appropriation when we have protests and uprisings across cities. Central spaces, squares, become key sites where the material and the symbolic come together in meaningful ways. It makes sense to the collective. And we all know how these squares played a major role in Arab cities, protests, but also beyond, like Tahrir Square in Egypt, in Cairo, the Pearl Square in Bahrain, Istiklal in Istanbul. This is Martyr Square in Beirut, but also squares and public spaces in secondary cities in Tunisia, Syria, Libya, Algeria, all played key roles in protests and opposition movements. A second, maybe let me say a few words on, just on this map, because it's an interesting one produced by Antoine Atalla at the time. So in 2019, the occupation of Beirut and Martyr Square specifically, and Azariya, led to the production of this map, which is a very close map to one that was produced about Tahrir Square, that shows how spatial appropriations happened in a central area of Beirut. But we also had the central space of Tripoli, Al Noor Square, that was also appropriated in similar ways. I mean, the comparison still needs to happen. It hasn't been done. And we also saw a lot of appropriation of other squares in Nabateeh, even if in lesser visible ways, but it was still, as a symbolic dimension, very important. And it demonstrated again how central squares are a substantive ingredient for collective action to be initiated, but also to expand and to consolidate. So the second category of appropriation is that of abandoned buildings, and in cities that have been marred by wars and conflicts, but also by real estate speculation and financialization. We have more and more of these abandoned, dilapidated buildings in cities. We have them in Beirut and Tripoli, and they have been used in the uprisings in 2019. They have been used for meetings, but also as canvas in the city, as backdrops of collective action, where projections were done on these buildings. You saw the egg building in one of the images, or maybe it's in the next slide. This is the Grand Théâtre, an abandoned building in Beirut that was also appropriated. The Ghandour building in Noor Square was another that was occupied and used by the protester and claimed as icon of the revolution. The third is infrastructure, and this is quite interesting because It's not only about highways, roads, tunnels, and bridges and spaces under the bridges and sidewalks that are occupied, but it's also about walls, fences, urban furniture, and micro infrastructure. Even any surface becomes plastered with graffiti and claimed, and stairs, broken benches, remnants of bus stops are transformed into food stalls or seating arrangements. So we see how all these elements in the city help protesters occupy the space, claim it, make themselves visible and their voices heard, disrupting traffic, but also setting up lounging areas, as you see here, and in many ways making a claim on the urban space, but also a claim as a right to a city, but also as a need to organize as a collective. And in addition to that, the micro-infrastructure bits can also take the form of banging on metal poles to express rage when repression reaches new heights and you cannot do anything but to express a noise as an expression of a certain rage or protest you want to do. So the key takeaways from this is that as they get reowned, these occupied urban spaces produce diverse stages where collective action gets organized. In both Beirut and Tripoli and other cities, these stages were set up in various sections of the city center. Parks became sites for teach-ins, parking lots became headquarters for oppositional groups, spaces were dedicated for communal kitchens, kid spaces, and cleanups. And in that sense, we see how collective action gets fortified and consolidated, and how they get transformed into these stages where contentious enactments are deployed according to a certain rhythm that takes place in the city. So that leads to the second dimension of how collective action gets consolidated when urban space becomes this series of performative stages that exist over a more or less short or long duration of time. And this echoes a lot with the specificities that shape urban social movements that were studied by Nichols and Ostermark in their book comparing Los Angeles and Amsterdam and the mobilization of immigrants in these both cities. And they highlight how political groups strategically select and utilize urban space for their political action. Sorry about that. And they do that through a variety of strategies, be it marches, sit-ins, protests, talks, or teach-ins. And in addition, they also highlight the importance of density and diversity in the city, which are ingredients that enable access of activists and protesters and political actors to relational opportunities and networks over a length of time. And in many of these squares and sites I've been showing you pictures of, we see that opportunities and networks were maximized. Generations of activists intersected together. They had been organizing for decades. They were discussing, organizing, planning together and strategizing. New groups were being formed. Larger groups were expanding. Coalitions were being created. Others were splintering. But this concentration of protesters and participants in a shared space, a shared urban space, endow them with emotion-generating interactions, as Nichols and Ostermark highlight, and that this is related to a sense of togetherness that is very important for fueling and shaping struggle, and that helps sustain this mobilization. So to conclude, this is mainly what we are able to extract when we think about urban space in relation to political action and political change. Urban space help through operating as multi-scalar performative stages to advance imaginaries of togetherness that are rehearsed and experimented with, even if for temporary periods of time. Within each space, there's an effective engagement that is essential for the expansion and consolidation of collective action and mobilization. This is how this is nurtured and it grows beyond the moment of the uprising itself over time. And this in this sense, the urban space shapes the lived experience of the protester in ways that will enable even if it's a preliminary or a transient envisioning of a shared future, of an imagining of another kind of city, which is owned and shaped by its own people. And I'll stop with that and thank everyone for their attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Muna. We're really appreciating your presentation and the insight you gave into Beirut, but other cities as well that were sites of protest and use of space in such creative ways by protesters. I'll pass the floor now to Dr. Ammar, and we're looking forward to hearing his presentation as well.
Thank you very much, everyone, for joining, and thanks for the organizers for the invite today. I'm also very humbled to be across distinguished speakers like Professor Muna Harb and Dr. Ola Mer'i, and always admire the work of Professor Muna Harb and her activism, and always wish to be a student of her. So I'm really humbled to be here today and grateful for this opportunity. For today's presentation, I'm going to focus on my own city, Homs in Syria, and reflecting some insights on the relationship between urban space in time of crisis and the communities who live and shape these spaces. I'll be mainly looking at the question that Yasmin has sent us on the relationship between the urban space and politics, with a focus on two squares in my city, Homs. So here we go. This is also a map of Syria I always put when we have an international conversation like today, and also the map of Homs, where I'm from. We're very close to Lebanon, and I think similar to the pattern of the conversation today, we have first Lebanon, so it's our border on the left, and we have Iraq, which is our border on the right. So we are in between these two spaces, two places, also similar to the pattern today. So Homs is the third largest city in Syria, and the conflict or the revolution started in March 2011, which led now after 10 years of struggle into displacement of over half of the population of the country. So almost more than 13 million people displaced either inside or outside the country. And my own city has been enormously destroyed. More than half of the neighborhoods have been heavily destroyed. Public spaces were the spaces where people went to protest and gather and ask for their rights. Because these spaces were the points of departure for people to come and raise their voices and ask for their hopes and dreams and aspirations, they were also contested and politicized. And this is why the city in Homs, as well as in many cities and towns and villages in Syria, they have become the sites of contestation. The spaces became the battlefields. And what happened inside Homs, that multiple sieges, I know that this is a very tiny map, but that's intentional, just to show that the city was sieged at different stages across different neighborhoods. Every time the government would be besieging a neighborhood where the rebels and civilians lived, in order to eventually let them surrender and displace them to the north of the country. So here you can see multiple sieges that the city of Homs has witnessed. It's definitely not inclusive, but there are some of the parts of the city that they were besieged. These are some of the spaces before the conflict. I always like to put these images just to show how the city looked like before. The public space, it doesn't as well seem to be public many times. So we are always fearful of gathering, and any gathering would draw some attention why people are gathering before 2011, before the revolution. So the public space was a place where people came together, but it was also a place of fear, and a place where people didn't feel that they can do any activities without having the approval of the authority in the space. The first square that I want to focus on today, it's called the New Clock Tower Square, which you can see some of the footage I took in 2009 in Homs. It's a very humble site. It's a tiny clock tower, but it turned suddenly into a symbol of Homs. So whenever any person in Homs in diaspora, they want to imagine the city, the clock tower comes to the mind. It is at the heart of the city, and it was the site where people went for their sitting in the protest. These are some of the images that you can see a little bit about the growth of the development of the site. It was built after the donation of Korjia Haddad, who is a woman from Homs who moved to Brazil, and she commissioned the building of the clock tower, and that was in 1964 that the building or the clock tower was built, where she came to open it. And suddenly, since that date in 1964, it became the symbol of the city, and different layers of meaning and understanding have become associated with this site. So, for instance, when a president comes to visit the city, they will be giving a speech there. When there's a football match, to do anything to celebrate, they would go there. So it really became as a hub or a center for the city and its imaginary. In April 2011, when the revolution erupted, people were protesting locally in their own neighborhoods. So in local streets, around small squares inside their own neighborhoods. But the hope was always to reach out to the city center, to the clock tower square, similar to what people have seen in many other countries across the North African countries with the Arab Spring, and then similar to the countries surrounding us at the time. So that was the main challenge, to go there, to organize something collectively, because people were stuck almost in their own neighborhood and they couldn't gather at the heart of the city. But eventually that happened on the 18th of April in 2011, where people decided to go and gather together there. And here I put an excellent article written by Wael Abdel Hamid, a Turkey-based writer from Homs, who has written about 10 to 12, which is As-Sa'a Thaniya al-Ashr, where the sit-in was being there, people were shouting, people were raising their voices saying 111, the Syrian people are one, Wahid, 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 Shab Suri Wahid. People were asking for their rights, for justice, for freedoms. And then at 10 to 12 in the night, that gathering was targeted, and many people were killed at the time. So it was the end of that sit-in. There is no confirmed number of the people who lost their life, who were killed on that day. But it suddenly, this specific site took a different layer of meaning. It didn't only represent the story of Homs and the history in terms of like the architecture and the space and the politics around it, but it also became the symbol of a city of rebellion, a city of revolution, that Homs became to be known as the capital of the revolution, Asim al-Thawra, in Syria. Now, since people were no longer able to come to protest in that space, they started building replicas of it in different neighborhoods, so they can imagine that they are protesting at the city center, but in different neighborhoods. Even that happened across different cities. So people standing in solidarity with Homs in Aleppo or in Damascus or in many other places, they would rebuild as a replica and pretend that this is the clock tower. But what I found really deeply moving is that even this clock tower has been built in a refugee camp inside Greece, where people would feel that rebuilding a replica of the clock tower would make a sense of Homs, or rebuilding Homs almost in exile. So you can here also see the clock tower. So this is the first square that I wanted to look at, the new clock tower square. The second one, which I only have a couple of slides on it, is the old clock tower square, which is also on the same street. So the two squares are connected to each other in one street. And here you can see the clock tower. And it also was a site where people marched to protest in 2011, and where people lost their life and near the clock towers. And now what we see after 10 years of protest and 10 years of war and conflict, that these squares are getting new meanings and new layers of memory. I'm putting here the same square. On the left, you see the tiny clock tower, which is very close to the Syrian flag. So the flag here represents the government, because the revolution has its own flag. So it means that the government is taking the site again. But what we see on the right here, if you see there's a black monument that was also built recently to cement the idea on who owns that site and who has won this war, which is a memorial to commemorate and remember the Syrian army that lost their life during the war for the government, of course. And in this, you can see that when people are still being displaced and when the community is enormously divided and where people are still struggling to find access to shelter, new memorials and new memory sites emerge as like a place to force a memory on people that you have to remember who's here and you have to imagine who is shaping this site. So it's almost rewriting the history of these two squares by building and planting new memorials. And here we ask questions on who do we remember and how do we remember and how can we, even as a collective, how can we see the trauma being implanted in physically in space, but how could one-sided memory also further divide the communities? So these two squares really represent the struggle of the people who went to the streets to ask for their freedoms, but also the government continuation to build more memorials to enforce the idea on who owns this space and who has the right to be remembered there. So that was the end of my presentation. I kept it quite short, and thank you so much for this opportunity, Yasmin.
Thank you. Thank you for such a moving presentation with really impressive images that show and illustrate so well what you were telling us about. I now welcome the last speaker. So Dr. Ola Omari, please take the stage, and we're really looking forward to hearing your presentation too. I'm sorry, Doctor, I think you might still be muted if you want to double check. Perfect. We can hear you now, I think.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you. Sorry for that. It was something happening in the middle. Well, thanks for having me today. I really moved by the presentation that you both did. And I think in my presentation, it would be something related and continue the discussion of owning the public place by the people and the community. In my presentation today, the urban square in the context of Baghdad, I'm going to discuss a little bit in more details two cases of two public squares, both widely known in the context of Baghdad and have got a great attention in the last 2 decades. I will analyze the politics and the regulation that have discouraged people from gathering in squares or prevent them or encourage them to gather in another public spaces, and how the government mobilized this place or try to reshape it in different political ways according to their political agenda. So how the people or the government modify or getting mixed historical norms to change the value of these public places. In Kevin Lynch, the image of the city, Kevin wrote a vivid and integrated physical setting, stating that a sharp image plays a social role as well as it can flourish and furnish a raw material of the symbolism, collective memory, also group communication. Therefore, a public built environment is the new fiction of physical and the behavioral patterns where streets can strengthen social movement, communication, and manufacturing public spaces. Lynch identified the three main aspects to the environmental image and how we can understand the environmental image, mentioning identities, structures, and meaning. The first where they give us a brief about how we can interact during this place. The first two aspects require recognizable identities and patterns of relation achieved by the physical features of the place, while meaning achieved through the sculptures with its historical and cultural significance in a collective memory. Yet in the case of Baghdad, as Cecilia Berry has suggested, that urbanism and the urbanism vision towards mobilizing the city, the capital city of Baghdad during the early of the last century was mostly improved and designed by colonial powers and later by a local government with their different political and ideological agenda. Thus, reiterating them would require a comprehensive image to recognize how these places redefined the true time. In Baghdad, in my cases today, I will discuss Firdaus squares and Tahrir squares, which they have both the power to evoke different emotions of belonging to the place. In today's presentation, I will argue how, and I'll argue and keep the discussion open toward further discussion, and how about to negotiate both of these places according to the political agenda. If you have a brief knowledge about Baghdad Firdaus square, or Firdaus, which refers to the paradise, is not an important square is it on right, but it is the seat or not the seat of the government, or to have control of any political access or strategic bridge to or highways. Yet it is the home of a world-class Fabric 8 mosque on the right of the city, and one of the tallest buildings, which is Sheraton Hotel and Palestine Hotel. But Baghdad's political powers actually lies on the other side or across this location. What makes this square is important? It is the monument of unknown soldier that had been built during the late of 15th of the last century by the architect Rafat Chadarchi, which were later replaced by Saddam monument in the early of 19, and later another version of it in the early of 2002 to celebrate his 65th birthday. So what makes this location is significant? It's its symbolism because of the day of the 9th of April in 2003. On that day, the first American battle tank, which pulled into Firdaus Square that Wednesday afternoon, sealing the falling of Baghdad and trying to publicitize this image and showing the world how the city of Baghdad, the capital city of Iraq, have been fallen by the US invasion. This image that will be represented everywhere, remembering the falling of Baghdad in 2003 and how the statues of Saddam Hussein being pulled down by the American soldiers, which were around 2 days after the US invasion already occupied many cities in the south of Iraq. But it was the image that they would like to emphasize and show to the public media. The toppling of Saddam Hussein's statue in the square that afternoon at that time may be and probably the most widely television image around the world after the 11th of September. And it has been seen across the world. For anti-war skeptics, it was an evidence that the American propaganda machines manufacturing symbols to watching the world, especially the Arab world, that we are here and there are new masters to control the city in the town. American commanders must have been known that whatever that happened in that square, it would be generally and widely known across the world, because they know that in the both hotels around this square, most of the international journalists and the television media, they were having their headquarters in this area, which was the same location that a few hours before this, the Iraqi Ministry of Foreign Affairs said that everything was under control and we are controlling the city and nothing will happen. So they come to this place exactly to show to the world that we are arrived here and we control the city and we now getting down the statue of Saddam from his location. Even though they can't see that, and they did that already in many palaces of Saddam Hussein around Baghdad, but choosing this place to memorize this image and to show it to the world was the main targeted point to make it available to the public media. After that, and after removing this statue, the place have been hosted an abstract structure, green structure, sculptures intended to symbolize freedom, designed by an Iraqi sculptor, Bassam Adouri, and built by a group of artists calling themselves the Najin, or the survivors. The replacement sculptures, who constructed quickly and completed within a month of its procedures, removed afterwards. And it makes the basic construction material with the basics abstraction of the symbols of Islam and the Sumerians by mobilizing a crescent moon and the sun to refer to the Sumerian civilization. This square witnesses its largest demonstration in the second anniversary of Baghdad occupations, and it was led by many Iraqi parties to marching toward this location to remember and to commemorate how the city fallen by the US soldiers, and trying to show to the world that we are not accepting the US invasion to Iraq, and we're still demanding our full independence from this location, which was around 2005. Yet, this place later on loses its powerful image after removing the green statues again in 2003 and changing the whole landscape of the place to make it a symbolic flat garden, removing all the columns that were referring to the 18th government of Iraq. So it loses its image, and they try to lose its identity and memorize its memory from the context of Baghdad. Just along the same street, Sadoun Street, which is reaching to the north to the Tahrir Square, while Firdaus Street was on the south of the Sadoun Street. There is another square that refers to different political image. So between the bridge and the square, the yellow circle here refers to the Tahrir Square, while the bridge refers to a Jumhuriya Bridge, which is the Republic Bridge. Al-Tahrir lies in the northern side of Firdaus Square along the same street of Sadoun, and it had and still its important role in many revolutions, marches, and uprisings in Baghdad. It's called Al-Tahrir, which is in Arabic mean liberations, and related to the freedom from the colonial power, and to commemorate and celebrate the 14th of July in 1958. The freedom movement is located in the eastern side of the square, around here, and it has been designed by the famous, well-known Iraqi architect, Rafat Chaderchi was one of the basic architects who designed the flat screen, while it was designed as sculptures by Jawad Salim, which was one of the well-known Iraqi modern artists during that time. The Freedom Monument reflects people's visions and how it's designed to build by the Iraqi artists and sculptors. It's what Salim, in his interpretation, it tried to commemorate the 14th of July revolution through 14 different monuments of the sculptures to show the story of the revolutions through different narrative and how the community or the whole population engaged within this revolution. But what Rafat Chaderchi do in his role, which is the same who has been previously designed in Firdaus Square, another statue before removing and putting Saddam Hussein statue. He designed the panel, the main panel, and said, let's make another type of banners which live forever. He getting the idea from creating a new banners to show the revolutions, where the people at that time, they always getting banners in their hand and try to show their demands. He created this idea and do it in a different way and make it a larger banners to show the revolutions main theme and idea. During 1950, the Tahrir Square itself was just a parking area, while in the 60s, which it's opened in 1963, it was transformed into a functional plaza. Then in the middle of the 70s, a tunnel was developed into this plaza again, until the 18th, when the city added more shops and small barber shops and small libraries in the tunnel to make it more functional. Yet during the 80s, the city or this tunnel lose its function due to many security reasons, and they block the tunnel down. So they try to minimize the access through and between the tunnel, which is going in the front of the Tahrir statues monument. Until 2003, the square, like any other public spaces, was supervised by police to prevent any type of political demonstration in this place, and importantly, to control the place from any physical gathering or the people ask for anything for it. So it was controlled by police. After 2003, the square was instated politically, but has fully recovered socially, despite the slight of development that surrounding the area around the Tahrir Square and the Amara garden, which was behind this location. Yet, since 2011, Tahrir Square represents a demonstration site and enhanced in 2015, which was like because of a call of well-known Iraqi religious party leader, Muqtada Sadr, who called for every Friday to be gathering there to show the government that we are there and we have demands to be delivered from the government, and we need to change to end the corruptions of the government and to control the Iraqi budget again. So this was like every Friday, they called for a new demonstration in this location. And they marched toward the square, even the street were around it blocked. So they were marching to where the square by foot, and they walk around the whole distance. What was interesting that during this specific time, which was the 15th of July in 2016, and it was just one day before when Haider al-Abadi, which was the prime minister at that time, asking and doing a first military parade in the same location to show the government and to show his powerful image to the world by calling it the Victory Day after fighting ISIS and how he reclaiming many Iraqi cities during that time. So the prime minister and the Ministry of Defense, which was also the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, Haider al-Abadi, do a large parade in the same location, which was just a day before Muqtada Sadr demonstration. So it was like every day we have different representation of power who will be claiming this place. This continued the same until 2019, when October was arrived, which was last a week, 2 weeks ago, when we celebrated the second anniversary of the 25th of October. It was a new generation and a new vision of how to occupy the public places by the community themselves, how the civil community acts toward these places. Between the bridge and the square, بين الجسر والساحة, which has become like a slogan or a thing that the young people of the protest saying it, they were marching on foot toward this place. The bridge represents the political power that come across the square from the other side, which had been closed by police, by armed forces, to control their access and to try to seize them in this place, while the square represents the places where they gather from all around Baghdad and from all other cities in Iraq to show their demonstration and make their voices reach to the world. The Iraqi protests in this place make it like a mini state. You can see how this place has been designed and rehabilitated. It's in similar way. It's similar to the Lebanese squares, how they making seating area, lawns, and even demonstration in different way, banners and settings. But what was even goes further here, it was the way that having the accessibility, moving between the protest, and how they making still an access toward the main area to get access if they have get injured or they have any severe danger from the armed forces that they trying to control their movement. So it was like there is a town in the middle, and there is another forces and zones around this place to control the access from the outside, also to protect the demonstration in the inside. And there is a small cars, which called them tuk-tuk. It's small, a representation of something very small, but quick. It was accessible to where this street and marching it. And later, during this mini state, it was different ways of community engagement, like the people who they're responsible about gathering and feeding and transforming the places, or even listening, having ideas how they develop the protest. It was like a small community with border guards around it. So there is a cleanup crews and hospital. Iraqi protests have created a mini state in this place, offering the kind of services, as they say, the government was failed to provide during the years. We've done more in 2 months than the state have done in 16 years, one of the main protests have said. And everyone here is engaging in different way in protecting this revolution. So this place, as you can see here, become a representation of the liberation, of the new vision of the youth. It was mostly by youth, led by youth. And the interesting thing here was the connection between the female and the male groups, how they work together to make this possible. It was not just for male, because otherwise, if it was just for boys or males, it might be controlled or by the political force, but having their sisters, their family, their mothers engaging in the same place, it makes it more like a social gathering to show that it is not a protest for individuals or group, it is by the whole community. One of the main landmarks during this site was this tower, which was a neglected tower called a Turkish restaurant. It was a neglected building for years. It was empty, no one occupied it. But the protesters tried to memorize it and they tried to symbolize it through calling it Jabal Uhud, as referring to the battle that happened between the Muslim and Quraysh in the period of early Islam. And using this area, Jabal Uhud, or this building, to vision and to have an access about the whole place of the revolution site. So the Iraqi protests, the women engagement, the white coat engagement of the doctors, also the white army by the students who gathering around the same tunnels here marching toward the same location of the protest. And also how the cooking, the medical, physical therapy locations, small beds, all have been done in this location. Also, the graffiti was one of the main symbolism of mobilizing this place to show the new vision and how they looking toward this place, demonstration, the new way of spreading their voices through graffiti, colors, and the women's role in this engagement. It was the perfect medium to show the social political environment and how it has been symbolized in other Iraqi cities, later in other Iraqi cities, to symbolize the revolution. So I am just going to finalize my slide by saying, according to the interpretation of Henry Livermore, space is defined as perceived spatial practice, conceived representation of a place, and lived representational spaces. So Tahrir Square was able to medium all these aspects and gather them in one social political environment and creating a new symbolism of revolutions in the contemporary history of Iraq. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And I think you gave a wonderful comparison between the two squares in Baghdad and how differently they represented very different political moments in recent history. So thank you for that. Just a reminder to everyone that if you have some questions, please to type them into the Q&A function and they'll come up so I can ask them to the speakers. I've got one or two so far, so please feel free to type in any more. The first, and we've got about another 15, 20 minutes, so there's definitely lots of opportunity to ask our wonderful speakers some questions about their presentations. I have one question here for Professor Harb, for Dr. Ramona. The question was focused on the issue of a historical example of some of the things that you talked about. So the person here wanted to know if you could say a few words about if and how the use of urban spaces to express different imaginations for the future had changed over time. Are there different historical examples to some of the things that you showed us in the presentation today? Was it always kind of in the same shape, or are there, histories in Lebanon of using these squares in a different way to voice protest demands?
Yes, thank you very much for the question, Anna. I think it's a rich question. Thank you for the opportunity to try to answer that, especially the second part of it. That would entail really going through a historicization of protest across time. And as you can imagine, there are many groups that have protested different issues. Being a post-colonial state, as most of the states being discussed here, contentious issues have been on the forefront of struggles for decades. So if we look as far as even the creation of Lebanon, we would see that there's a very heavy history of urban space and their usage over time. It would make a very interesting research actually to trace that and to see what has been the evolution of centrality of urban spaces, but also streets, not only squares. Where have people marched over time, where the different protests take place? What comes out very, very prominently is definitely when we look at Beirut, at Martyr Square, which is very well documented in many books and writings since the creation of the nation state of Lebanon. The name of Martyr Square was given to the martyrs of the independence themselves. For people who fought against the French for the independence of Lebanon and who were martyred there. Against the Ottomans and who were martyred there. So, and this is a political history of just Beirut, which is a city that gets born, I would say, in the late 19th century. If we look at the urban political history of Tripoli, we would get, I'm sure, a different geography of these protests over time. I'm more familiar with the Beiruti one, but I think the political history of Tripoli would be also very interesting to trace historically. Now, I'm focusing more on a more contemporary period that I've been more researching, which is about the post-Civil War era. So about 3 decades of I would say activism, not necessarily protest, that has been that has been organized by urban and environmental activists. We see that the way they have been using urban spaces in the city is not only concentrated in the downtown of Beirut, but is a much more diverse geography, and it takes more the form of marches from a point to the other, mostly related to the issue that is being claimed. So we move from, let's say, a Ministry of Interior to a Ministry of Environment, or from a site that we want to reclaim because there's a project happening there and we don't want it to happen, to another site, or we do a sit-in or a protest in a site. So in that sense, the geography relate to
Are we maybe having a technical issue, or?
Are you hearing me?
We can hear you okay, just no image. Are you okay to continue, or have you lost power perhaps? Okay, I might pose the next question just while we wait for Dr. Mona to join us again, just in case maybe I don't know if there's an electricity issue or something like that. So I hope she can join us again. The next question I had was actually for Amar, if you don't mind. I wanted to, or there's a question around if you could reflect a little bit on this question of displacement or exile and the connection to space. In your presentation, you mentioned this reproduction of the clock tower square, even in moments of displacement in a displacement camp in Europe. So it would be great to hear from you a little more about this continued connection to space and its important symbolism for Syrians who are living outside of Syria, whether temporarily or on an ongoing basis. It would be great to hear more reflection from you on that.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question. And I think just to highlight that I myself have left in 2011 and I never returned since 2011. So my reflections, my insights are all from somebody who lives abroad. And I think for many of us, so there are more than 6 million Syrians who have been displaced from their home outside Syria since 2011. The home or the sense of the city is also being reconstructed in many different ways. And I think this is where we think about the representation of place and the representation of space. And I think one of these efforts that have been done to remember and to reconstruct that sense of place is the work of researchers and writers. So, for instance, the writing about the city, the writing about the space, the recreation of monuments, the recreation of events and rituals and traditions, they all carry on with the city. And in Manchester, for instance, where I currently live for a few months, there's a charity called Rethink Rebuild Society, and they also organize every year or every 2 years now a festival called Celebrating Syria, where they bring the work of writers, artists, poets, painters, actors, actresses to the conversation. And at the heart of these conversations, you have the rebuilding of the city from diaspora. And we see this with every diasporic community. So, for instance, when we look at the Spanish Civil War, Picasso's drawing from Paris about Guernica, the destruction of Guernica, the town in Spain, was from his exile in Paris. So we think now as people outside, inside, what everyone is doing is different. The people inside, they have their everyday life there. The people who are uprooted and forcibly displaced, they have a different sense of rebuilding that home through the writing, through the artwork, through filmmaking, through documenting from outside.
Thank you for that overview. And I would invite, I guess, our audience to also look up on Twitter your account, because I know you've published on this idea very recently, a short article. So it would be nice if anyone was interested to read more about your thoughts on this. Dr. Muna, would you like to pick up where you left off now that you were able to join us?
Yes, sorry, that was an electricity cut, and anyway, that's our life in Lebanon, interrupted.
An example of how urban space can really shape our connections even over the internet. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes, sorry about that. So where was I? I was trying to explain how the variety of ways through which political mobilization utilizes geographies of space and shifts between what I would qualify as issue-based demands versus more transversal demands. And I would say if there's a transformation that happened over time, is that issue-based demands that were more focused on certain projects or sectors. So we are against the development of a coastal site along the Sea of Beirut, or against the building of a resort by the sea, or we want the reopening of a public park to happen, or we don't want the construction of a highway to happen, which are more issue-based demands around these projects, transformed over time into more cross-cutting issues, where activists and protesters and political movements started coalescing around issues of rights to the city, demanding public space across sites, having a waste management policy that is more sustainable, being against the privatization of public space. So this intersection of different demands, but also of groups, made these demands materialize in urban space differently as well. And we see that in certain moments of mobilization, over, I would say, a historical timeline when people mobilized to participate to the municipal elections in 2018 in the city of Beirut around the banner of one movement called Beirut Madinati at the time, where you have a variety of political groups and social groups that ally under different banners, but with that demand of right to the city. And then you see it again in 2019, where these demands, I would say, are even more generalized under a demand for justice, or under a demand of against corruption, or of people-centered policies. So I would say, and this is where we see that, the claim over space, it becomes, even in downtown Beirut, it's a claim over all of the spaces of the city. It's a reclaiming of squares, but also private space, abandoned buildings, highways, infrastructure. It's as if these claims are able to expand even their urban spatialities, as we've seen, I would say, in the case also of Baghdad and cities in Syria, where you see that a density, a concentration of social demands in urban spaces across scales, but across categories of urban space as well. I find this fascinating, these intersections that happen in several cities in the Arab world, where you have these movements of young people, environmentalists, people demanding human rights, LGBTQ mobilization, all these intersections of demands coming in one space, claiming rights under a banner of justice or rights or autonomy or anti-corruption or democracy. And so I think this is my quick answer to that. Now, historical cases, that's a fascinating question. I wish I would have the time to go there, but I was recently invited to engage in a reflection about how the uprisings in Beirut echo demands for I would say issues that were claimed in Paris 150 years ago. It was the anniversary of the Commune, the Paris Commune, and there was an event in Berlin celebrating this and asking people around the world to reflect on how the Paris Commune inspired mobilization around the world. And the history of the Paris Commune is an amazing history when you look at it over time as a struggle that took decades, and that was about people-centered demand to the city, that was very violently repressed by the French authorities at the time, by the bourgeoisie, against the workers. And when you look at history, there are a lot of very interesting cases that echo and resonate with uprisings and protests we see today, and that remind us, and I think I'll end with that struggle is a very long journey that takes decades to happen. That it's not a journey that takes years. It's a journey that takes decades, sometimes centuries, with huge interruptions related to authoritarianism and to repression. So things happen in ebbs and flows over a very long period of time, and that would be, something we need to remember. And history teaches us this, that struggles are not something that happens at one time and change happens straight afterwards. But there are learnings that happen, there are connections that happen. The imaginaries that I mentioned, I think the question was related to them, is also about these rehearsal that we learn every time we protest, and every time we gain some ground. Maybe we go back, one step forward and 10 steps back. But what we gain is something qualitatively very substantive for the struggle, because we have rehearsed the political imaginary collectively. It allows us to do the next protest in a more organized and mature way, but sometimes it takes a lifetime to maybe see it, and maybe it's not even a lifetime, maybe it's a generation until change actually happens. So I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thank you for that. The last, we've only got a couple or maybe 5 more minutes, so I will pose one last question that's open to everyone. It would be great to hear from you, Ola, as well, around the question of reconstruction. So what happens after conflict, after disaster, though unfortunately in this case, all 3 cities we've talked about here have been the site of conflict. Beirut maybe more historically than Baghdad and Homs, of course. So what can you tell us about when you think about the issue of reconstruction? Who has the loudest voice when it comes to reshaping the city after conflict, or maybe how conflict has reshaped the city itself? Beirut, of course, has many scars from a historical conflict. Amar, we saw your presentation, really some very striking images about what is being rebuilt and what is remaining in need of reconstruction. And Ola, of course, Baghdad has been, the site of many political interventions that have reshaped the city. So if anyone has some final thoughts and they would like to discuss this topic, we'd love to hear from you about that question in particular.
Well, for the case of Baghdad, the reconstruction is different, because I think because I can relate it on the case of Firdaus Square. Even when the government later on tried to adopt this place to gather the protests and asking them to gather in this place to control them and also to make it like a gathering area instead of Tahrir Square, the people refused to get back to this place. And they prefer to go to Tahrir Square, south this place. Maybe because this place now have, it's not about the Saddam Hussein, it's about the falling of the city. It became a representation of falling of Baghdad and how it's been occupied by the US invasion. So the people gathers in more a national monumental place, gathering in the Tahrir Square. Its name, it's the sculptures there, the monuments, it's referring to something more widely gathering all the segregated community of Iraq. So they're trying to make a new generation when they believe about one unified national identity. So they abandoned these places. So I think the people, the community, the civil community, they have the ability to recreating new narratives according to the notions, to their own notions, not about the political agenda. The political agenda might try to seize them, to capture them in one place, but they will find another way to symbolize their visions and their revolutions. There is also an interesting thing of that, because even when in different Iraqi cities, when they do not have this kind of public places to get engaged or gather, so during the same October Revolution, the 25th of October Revolution, they try to mimic, as Amar mentions, the clock tower. They also try to mimic this, the freedom monuments in smaller places, to show their unified, their visions is equally unified with the main revolutions in Baghdad, to show their sympathy towards the revolutionary community there. So the people, I think they would have always the higher voice to show.
That's a really fascinating example as well. Is there any final comments from our other two speakers before I say goodbye to everyone?
Can I jump in quickly for the reconstruction? Just a quick one. I think as Dr. Dathia Rose says that we need to deconstruct the reconstruction word, and looking at the very many re's in the reconstruction, it's the rewriting of history. It is the remodeling the city. It is the reshaping. It is the rebuilding. But I think if I pick one re for today, it would be the rebuilding the hope that what we see in Baghdad, what we see in Beirut, what we see in Homs, we do not forget that hope that brought people to the streets, the hope that people made sacrifices with their life, with their children. And I think for the reconstruction, we must keep this the reconstruction of the hope at the heart, because it's so easy for the powerful to rewrite this history, and how important for us to resist this rewriting. Thank you.
If I may just also say something, as a country which went through 15 years of civil war and ended the civil war without any justice that addressed the root causes of the war, that brought warlords to political rule, and that is now undergoing a collapse, largely because of these major mistakes and wrong choices. I would urge to think also about reconstruction in relation to justice. There can not be a reconstruction that is sustainable, that is enduring, that is fair, without justice. It cannot be forgotten. Impunity cannot endure time. The conflict also needs to be addressed, as difficult and as painful as it is. Justice is at the core of reconstruction. Even as architects and urbanists, we need to recognize this while we're working. We can make the most beautiful plans of reconstruction. Again, Beirut is a very sad example of that. Downtown Beirut has been reconstructed by star architects, it's the most prominent urban design reconstruction model you'd see. Architecture students have visited it to as an example of how post-war reconstruction should happen. It's now a ghost town that's completely empty of any life, largely because of issues of justice that have not been addressed as a premise of post-war reconstruction. So these are my 2 bits coming from a country that's paying the price of reconstruction that has not been done on the basis of social justice, and where the issues of the root causes of the war have not been addressed, unfortunately.
Of course. Thank you. Thanks to all 3 of you for your wonderful presentations this afternoon or this evening. We're so grateful to hear from each of you about each city that you have expertise on, but it's so clear as well to all of us how interconnected and simultaneously very local, but also very connected these questions are. We see the repetitions across these spaces and the connections between what's happened in each, historically and in a contemporary sense. So we're very grateful to hear from the 3 of you about these 3 cities and some of the ongoing concerns. But I hope that we leave with a message of hope, as Amar left us with, that it's important to remember both what people have sacrificed in order to have access to these spaces, but also what that means in thinking about the future, politically, economically, socially, but of course in thinking about urban space too. Thank you to the 3 of you. Thank you to everyone who joined us online as well. We're very grateful for your questions and your attention. And I hope that we see you next time at the next webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Goodbye, everyone.